Still, we are discussing the pulse wave Doppler, and now we come to the hemodynamics and interpretation of Doppler waveform. First to discuss is the normal arterial flow, and as you see here in these three diagrams, we have here the Doppler spectral waveform, and actually this is a high resistance flow, as you see. First to know that this is the systole and this is the diastole. This is basic information, so it doesn't add a lot. And this one here, this is the area below the systolic wave. This is usually called the window. We might have the window also under the diastole, but commonly when you want to discuss the window, look at the systolic wave or the systolic component of the wave. And last thing to mention here, when you measure the peak systolic and the end diastolic velocities, this is the peak systolic velocity, and actually it goes here coincide with the point. This is the vertical arm, which is the velocity. So it coincides the point here, and this point is the velocity of the systole. And we have here also diastole, and this is the end of the diastole, and it coincides here with the point along this vertical arm, and this is the end of diastolic velocity. Another point to discuss with the arterial waveform is the acceleration time, and this is the time that we can see here from the start of the systole to the time of the peak systole. So this arm is the time, which is the x-axis of the waveform, and this x-axis denotes the time. So starting from here to here, this is the time, what we call acceleration time. This is the time taken from the start of the systole to the peak of the systole. So this is the time, we call it acceleration time. As we see in the look at here in this diagram here, you see that the acceleration time is prolonged, is elongated. Why? There is low energy of this waveform. This waveform is describing the low energy wave. So I'm having either in cases of generalized, like a patient having severe heart failure, or a localized area in the distal to a tight stenosis. If there is a tight stenosis, you know, stenosis means narrowing of a vessel. So if there is a tight stenosis, and this will consume a lot of the waveform of the energy, and I'm getting here, the time it takes from the start of the systole to the peak of the systole, you see here it's longer. In this condition, we call it tardus parvus, when we have the prolonged acceleration time, and as we see here also, the peak of the systole is slower than it should be. So there is here tardus, delayed, parvus means low waveform, low systole. After studying the normal arterial waveform, now we come to the how can I tell the direction of the flow. Direction of the flow, it could be either above the baseline or below the baseline. Above the baseline means it is toward the transducer. Below the baseline, it means the flow is away from the transducer. So if you look at here this diagram, if I consider this here the flow of the blood in this artery here, okay, I have here transducer A and transducer B. Transducer A, we see here the flow is going away from this transducer. How it looks like the waveform, it will be here below the baseline. So condition A here, when we have the flow below the baseline, it denotes that the flow is going away from the transducer. The other flow here, which is in condition B or transducer B, you see here because that flow is going towards the transducer, I will get here the flow above the baseline. So here we'll discuss the difference between laminar and turbulent flow. Laminar flow, this is the flow that is the commonest type of flow what we have in our vessels, in arteries or veins even. This is the laminar flow. When the flow is parallel to each other, the flow lines are parallel to each other, and I will get here a narrow spectrum. As you see here, this is the spectrum, a narrow spectrum, and it leaves below the flow here, there is a clear area, we call it a window. So I'm having here a clear window, and this clear window, it denotes that there is a laminar flow. As mentioned earlier, that you might see the window below the systole and the diastole, but most commonly you can see it clear more in the systolic part. Now we come to the other waveform here. This is what we call the turbulent flow. What happens here? The spectrum gets broader. So I'm having broad spectrum. You see the difference? This is the spectrum here narrow, and the spectrum here is broad. So broad spectrum, and you can see here in the systolic part or the systolic component of the flow, you see here there is filling of this window here, or what we call spectral broadening with filling of the window. So this turbulent flow that we already mentioned in the last slide, is it always denoting that there is a turbulence flow? No, it's not the way, because sometimes there is an artifactual or non-turbulent spectral broadening. This usually comes with errors in scanning. Example, for example, if the sample volume is placed in the vessel's periphery, okay, what happens there? This sample volume will sample flow that is close to the periphery of the vessel, which is usually a lower velocity, and another part of the flow that is closer to the center of the flow, which is a higher velocity. So what happens now? There is a wide range of velocities being sampled by the sample gate or the sample volume. What happens now? I will get broadening of the spectrum of velocities. Another one here, if I'm having a wide sample volume or a wide gate, what happens? It's the same principle. The sample volume is sampling a wider range of velocities. I will get spectral broadening. Or there is a high Doppler gain, which is sometimes it's an artifactual also, an overgaining of the Doppler spectral waveform. You will get here filling of the window and spectral broadening because of this high gain. So these are artifactual, they are not true spectral, or they are true spectral broadening, but they are not indicating there's a turbulence flow. But some other factors that bring a spectral broadening, these are the true turbulence. So there is true turbulence flow. But is it always turbulent flow? Is it, or spectral broadening, is it always a pathological indication? No, sometimes it comes physiologically. And we are all familiar with the carotid bulb. The carotid bulb, it has part of the flow is reversal. So if you see it in the color, you see part is red and another part is blue. And also when you do put the spectral broadening, you see there is flow forward and flow away, and there is turbulence of the flow, and there is spectral broadening. So this is a physiologic one. Another example, there is abrupt change of the flow direction. For example, you will see it in the ostium of the renal arteries because there is sudden change of the direction. This will create spectral broadening. If you remember the Reynolds number, which is a turbulent flow, either a very high velocity or change in the direction of the flow. This will create also spectral broadening. So these are physiologic. Of course, we know all of us that we know that there is what we call the post-stenotic turbulence, which is the area next to the stenosis, or just at the end of the stenosis, and the vessel gets a little wider. There is and this is the pathological spectral broadening. So this brings me to what you call the stenosis profile, or a significant stenosis profile. Of course, not all the stenosis are the same degree. We have some degrees like more than 50 or 60%. This is called significant stenosis. And this is the one that we're going to discuss here. So if we put the vessel like in this example here, we have a long artery, and we have here the area that is called the pre-stenosis. An area here, this is the area of the stenosis or at stenosis. This is an area C, which is most of the time they call it post-stenosis. And as you see here, this is the turbulence. And this is the one I just explained last slide. And again, we have here the distal to the stenosis or area D. And this is the one that has the tarsus parvus. So again, we have pre-stenosis, at stenosis, post-stenosis, and distal to the stenosis. And these are the coinciding spectral waveform that are matching these areas. We'll come to these in details here. So at the pre-stenosis, what will the Doppler spectrum waveform looks like? Most of the time, it's within the normal range, like the rest of the art before the stenosis. Most of it has the same waveform. But just in case if the stenosis is too tight, like 80 or 90%, what happens here? This tight stenosis, it will act as a resistance against the flow. So what will happen here? The flow, it looks like a high resistance. So you get lower diastole, and there is a reversal of the flow here. So this is like a high resistance flow. It sometimes happens in the pre-stenosis area if the area of the stenosis is too tight, which is not the all cases of stenosis have this kind of tight stenosis. Sometimes they are not that tight. This is the area of stenosis or at stenosis. What you happen here? Because of that tight flow, and the flow should have a high velocity. You know, they said the rule of continuity rule. I have the same flow that, or the volume of the flow from the area before the stenosis to the area after the stenosis. I should have the same flow. And this volume of flow, when it goes to a narrow area, it should go faster. Why? Because I have to have the same volume to go from this area to the next spot, and it happened to have a high velocity. So this explains why there is a high velocity in the area of the stenosis, because of the continuity rule. So what happens next here? Because of this high velocity, again, we know that there is a Reynolds number. The Reynolds number now is related to the velocity of the blood. If I'm having a high velocity, I will get a higher Reynolds number. What happens here? I will get spectral broadening. So I have here again spectral broadening at the area of the stenosis. So again, I have a higher velocity, as you see here. Second point, I will get here, because of the high velocity, I will get spectral broadening. This high velocity could be like twice or higher than the pre-stenosis area. So it could be like 200%, sometimes 300% velocity increase. And it might, some cases, it might reach higher than 300 or 400%. Okay, and those are in the area of vascular. They have encountered cases like this or higher. What happens here? I get this high velocity. Be careful here. You might get aliasing. So you need to get the scale here. You get the velocity scale. You increase it as much as possible to avoid the aliasing of the artery here. Now we come to the next spot, which is area C. We have area B, which is the stenosis, and we have area A, which is before the stenosis or pre-stenosis. And now we come to the area C, which is post-stenosis. Always, whenever the significant stenosis, I will get here spectral broadening and turbulence. We call it post-stenotic turbulence. What is the signs here in the Doppler spectrum waveform that indicate there is post-stenotic turbulence? Look at here, there is filling of the window. So the window here is full. Another point here, you might have reversal of the flow. And this reversal, most of the time, is systolic reversal. Systolic reversal, always remember this is systolic, not diastolic, because in the diastole, the velocity will damp down. So I will not get a high turbulence. I will not get a high Reynolds number because the velocity damps down in the diastole. So I will not get a high Reynolds number, and most of the time there is no turbulence in the diastole because what? The velocity is low. So as we see here, the turbulence usually happen in the systolic part, the systolic component. And you see here there is reflexive or the systolic reversal of the flow. So in the post-stenosis, what happens? I get spectral broadening and systolic reversal. This will remind me what we call diastolic reversal. This happens when you have a high, we'll come to this in a moment, when you have a high resistance. What happens in high resistance? I will get early diastolic reversal. There is here different types of reversal. Systolic, usually this happens with in the post-stenotic turbulence and in the tight stenosis, and the other one, which is diastolic reversal, and usually this happens in the early diastole of a high resistance flow. Now come to the last part, or to the last component of the significant stenosis profile, which is the distal to the stenosis. Distal means that couple of centimeters, like 5-10 centimeters, a little bit away from the stenosis. At what happens here, the turbulence of the post-stenotic turbulence will come down, and I will get here like forward flow, most of the time I will not get this reversal of the flow. But again, because of the tight stenosis, what happens? Many or big component of the energy is consumed because of the friction, because of the turbulence. All of these are consuming the energy. What happens here? We get low energy. So as you see here, like we see, remember the acceleration time. The acceleration time here it becomes elongated, and because of the low energy, I will get the waveform. The peak systolic is not that high compared to the pre-stenosis. So after the stenosis, the peak systolic velocity will damp down, and I will get elongation of the acceleration time. These two conditions called what? Tardus parvus. Tardus means delayed, parvus means lower velocity. Now we come to another point that we need to discuss, which is the resistance of the vessel, or what you call the high resistance or low resistance. Before discussing this, we need to know something about two forces or two opposing forces. One is the driving force, or the delta P, the delta P, the pressure gradient or the energy gradient on one side, and the other side there is what you call the resistance. So these two forces are opposing each other. Let's discuss first the delta P, or the pressure resistance, the pressure gradient. Okay, this pressure gradient is not the same all the time. It varies during systole and diastole. In systole, what we have? We have a high pressure gradient. Why? Because this pressure force, or this systolic force, coming from the heart, myocardial contraction. On the other side, when you come to the diastole there is an energy, yes, it keeps the blood flowing forward. But the energy here is coming from what? From the recoil of the arterial wall. Which vessels or which arteries? Usually the big arteries like the aorta, its branches, almost up to the vessels that we feel in the arms and legs. Okay, this is the thing that will happen in the arteries. When the systolic wave goes inside the artery, it creates a little distension or little stretch over the arteries wall. So this arterial wall stretch happens because the tunica media, if you remember the tunica media of the arteries, it has smooth muscle fibers and elastic fibers. These elastic fibers are capable of stretching and recoiling back. So when they recoils back, it will create or help to keep forward the flow because it delivers this energy back to the blood. So the arteries get some of the energy during the systole, the arterial wall gets some energy during the systole and returns back to the flow during the diastole. But as we expected, this energy here in the diastole is not as high as the systolic waveform or the systolic component. So what happened now? I have again the delta P, or the pressure gradient, which is coming from the heart, which is systolic component, and coming from the recoil of the arteries, which is the diastolic component. This recoils stretch and recoil back. This is the thing that we can feel it at the pulse. If you put your arm, your fingers on your radial arteries or in the carotid, you can feel the pulse. This is why, because the stretch of the vessel and recoil back. So this is one thing that we need to mention about the delta P, or the pressure gradient. Another component that we need to mention here is the resistance. Resistance means that we have if you go to the anatomy of the arteries, at the very end there are arterioles, and the arterioles are, we call them the resistance vessels, or these are the vessels that are capable of contraction and relaxation, or what we call vasoconstriction or vasodilation. What this phenomena ends up, it ends by either the arterioles are closed or the arterioles are open, okay, or get narrow or wide. When it gets narrow, it applies a resistance to the flow. So again, the systole can overcome this resistance, because these arterioles, when they constrict, they are not that strong enough to oppose the systolic wave which is coming from the heart. It's a high energy, so it will allow the forward flow of the flow toward the tissues. But during diastole, as you mentioned earlier, the diastolic energy is not that high, and that's why the vasoconstriction here, it will be capable to block this flow. Okay, I will get here low diastole. Let's have this in the coming slide. So in here in this slide, this is it explains what you call the high resistance or low resistance flow. What happened in the high resistance? Again, there is peripheral vasoconstriction. Peripheral means what? In the tissues. So the arterioles are vasoconstricted. I will get a high resistance to the flow. When I scan the artery now, not the arterioles. Remember, we are not scanning the arterioles. We are scanning the artery. So the artery, it obeys what the arterioles are doing. If the arterioles are in a condition of vasoconstriction, the artery will show a high resistance flow. So get here what we call the diastole, as we mentioned earlier, diastole, because this is a low energy driving force. I will get here the flow either by the baseline or a little above the baseline. But also sometimes you notice here, as we notice this area here, this is early diastolic reversal, another sign of a high resistance arterioles. So the arterioles at the very end of the artery, at the very end of the road, they reflect over the flow of the main artery that you are scanning. Okay, so this kind of flow we call it triphasic because we have here systole, early diastolic reversal, and then late diastolic forward flow. So this is here what we call the high resistance. Okay. The other kind of flow, which is called the low resistance, what happens here, there is peripheral vasodilation. There is a low resistance. The arterioles are not opposing against the flow. So what happened, the flow here will keep forward systole and diastole. Some people call it the forward flow along the whole cardiac cycle. What is the cardiac cycle? We have systole and diastole. Both systole and diastole are forward flow. So I'm getting here what you call forward flow along the whole cardiac cycle. But the forward flow here is not the same all the time. During systole, we're having a high forward flow, of course. But during diastole, I still have forward flow, but it's not as high as the systole. But still, compared to the diastolic flow here, diastole here and here, you see that the diastolic flow in the low resistance is higher than the diastolic flow during the high resistance. So low resistance having high diastole, high resistance I will get low diastole. Okay, this example we can see it where the low resistance we are having what we call vital organs like the brain, the liver, kidneys. These are famous examples of low resistance flow. They are vital organs. Sometimes you see this low resistance flow in some vessels that are supplying the area, and this area it shows like temporary activity and temporary not activity. For example, intestine, SMA, supramesenteric artery. Sometimes if you eat, there is a vasodilation, so you get a low resistance flow. If you are fasting for a long time, the intestines is not doesn't need all that much blood, so the arteries will close and you will get what you call the high resistance. Another example same like this is the muscles of the legs and arms. So these are skeletal muscles. If you are running or jogging, your vessels or your arteries in the leg, for example, the femoral or the popliteal, they show a low resistance. Why? Because the arterioles are open to supply blood to the active muscles. If you the opposite, when you have rest, for example, you will get high resistance flow. The last part to discuss here, I think we discussed it before me in details a little bit, which is aliasing. What is the aliasing? And there is a discrepancy between the Doppler shift, which is reflecting the high velocity or low velocity. So the Doppler shift is reflecting the velocity, and the other arm we have the Nyquist limit, which is half of the PRF. So we have here a balance. Okay, if they're having the Doppler shift is high because I'm having a high velocity, I will get a higher Doppler shift, and the Nyquist limit is not high enough, I will get aliasing. So aliasing happens what? When you have Doppler shift is far beyond the Nyquist limit. Okay, so the part of the Doppler shift that's above the baseline will show aliasing, and as we see here, this part of the systolic component here is aliased. Why? Why is I mention this? Because it's below the baseline. There's a misrepresentation of the forward flow to be represented as below the baseline, although it should be above the baseline. But since the scale here is not high enough, and I will get lower Nyquist limit, okay, Nyquist limit is low because the scale is low, I'll get here aliasing of the spectral waveform. So now we come to the continuous wave Doppler spectral waveform. So this continuous wave Doppler technique can be performed by one of two techniques, either in the dedicated continuous wave probe. This is a probe that is only doing continuous wave. That's why I like to call it the dedicated, because it does nothing except the CW. And this is the commonest one. And actually, in the exam, if somebody mentioned about any question about the CW, this is the one they mean. But also, we need to know something here, that we have also array transducers, like the curvilinear, the linear, or the phase array. We all know these probes, and they are having a continuous wave application. What happened in these probes to act with the continuous wave, that they are two crystals or more are dedicated or used to transmit the continuous wave. So we have here one or two crystals that are used to continuously transmit the beam and or the sound waves, and another one that is continuously receiving the waves. And again, there is an area of overlap here. So again, continuous wave can be performed with the array transducer, but this is not the one that they ask in the exam, unless they mention this clearly, the continuous wave performance in the array transducers. But if they mention just continuous wave, this is the one that they are talking about. So now we come to the CW dedicated probe, sometimes called the PEDOF probe or the blind pencil probe. It's commonly used in the echocardiography. This probe is made of what? It's made of two crystals, one that is continuously transmitting, so this is the direction of transmission, the red one, and another one that is continuously receiving, and this is the reception direction here. In between these two directions, there is an area of overlap. So this overlap area, if any movement here, it will be displayed on the screen. Movement here away from the area of overlap doesn't show. So this overlap, it acts as a big, as if we have the sample volume in the pulse wave. It acts like as if there is a sample volume, but this sample volume here is huge. As you see here, it can accommodate one or more vessels in the area of overlap. Okay, so how can I adjust the angle then? Because I don't have an image. This is non-imaging probe. Okay, it's not pulse wave, it's a continuous wave. So I have no image here. How can I adjust the angle to be 60? By adjusting the angle of the probe to the skin to be 60, because most of the times the vessel is parallel to the skin. What are the components of this CW dedicated probe? Okay, like I mentioned earlier, if somebody asks about the CW in the exam, this is the one they talk about, the dedicated probe, not the CW activity in the array transducers. Unless they, like I mentioned earlier, unless they mention clearly about the CW activity in the array transducer. But if they just mention CW, this is the one. Okay, CW probe is not imaging. We can't get an image. It's only spectral waveform. Only spectral waveform. Again, CW brings me only spectral waveform, no image. That's why it has some limitations in its use. So what are the components here? The components are, we have two crystals. They are head here in the head. They are two crystals here, one for continuous transmission and one for continuous receive. There is a matching layer. Of course, there is a matching layer like any probe, but there is no damping layer. Okay, so this transducer has two crystals, a matching layer, but no damping layer. Why? Because I don't want to damp the transmitted waves. I want them to be in a continuous transmission. Since we don't have a damping layer, so there is no imaging. It's non-imaging probe. It's a narrow band. It's a high Q and high sensitivity. All of these come with a bundle. As far as we have no damping layer, I will have these come as a bundle together. Okay. The probe frequency here is determined by what? We have here, like I mentioned, there is a PCT that's located here that continuously transmitting. Okay, at which frequency is transmitting the waves is because of the frequency here is determined by what? Determined by the electricity delivered from the transmitter or the pulsar of the ultrasound system that is delivered to the CW crystal here. So this frequency, the ultrasound frequency, is determined by the electric frequency. How the received echoes are processed. The received echoes or the received Doppler shift is processed via the fast Fourier transform. Same technology that is used in the Pulseweave, fast Fourier transform. Okay, the CW Doppler tracing will be demonstrated as a spectral broadening. Why? Because we mentioned that there is a wide sample volume or the area of overlap. This area of overlap is sampling all the velocities, almost all the velocities of the vessel. So starting from the very low velocity to the very high velocity, all of them are sampled. I will get for sure there is spectral broadening. And this CW probe, that because it has no listening time, so all the Doppler shifts are processed, and I will not get aliasing at all. So there's no aliasing, there's spectral broadening, and the technology used is the same as the Pulsewave, which is the fast Fourier transform, FFT. So what are the benefits or the advantage of the CW? Okay, there is no aliasing. This is the one famous thing about the CW. Why there is no aliasing? We mentioned earlier that aliasing happens when they have the Doppler shift is higher than the Nyquist limit. If I'm increasing the PRF, what happened? The Nyquist limit is increased. If I have more increase with the PRF, so I'm having more pulses, very rapid pulsations, I will get, for example, thousands and thousands. And then we come to the point that I have a continuous stream. When I have continuous streaming, that the PRF is almost infinity here. And this infinity means that the Nyquist limit is unlimited. So there is no Nyquist limit. And that's why I will not get aliasing, because whatever the Doppler shift is, it will never be beyond the infinity. Okay, so it can display all the velocities, all the high velocities, and also it can display the lower velocities. Why? Because no damping layer, so that the received echoes will not be damped as they are received. So I can get also the lower velocities. So the extremes of velocities will be detected easy by this probe. Okay, again, we have a small footprint, and that's why many times it's used by the echocardiography. It's not expensive, and we all know that is sometimes it can be manufactured as a separate device, have only the CW activity. So what is the limitation now? So we know that the benefits. The limitation is that since I don't have a pulse wave, I don't have a listening time, I don't have an image. So no imaging. And since I have no image, I cannot put the sample volume at any segment of the vessel. I cannot tell which vessel is being scanned unless I know it by anatomy. But I cannot tell which area that is being scanned by this probe. So this is there is what we call range ambiguity. Again, remember that we are talking here about the dedicated CW. We are not talking about the CW in the array transducers, because in the array transducer, some of these limitations are overcome. Okay. So again, we are talking about the dedicated continuous wave. Okay. And again, I have a narrow band of frequencies. As we see here, there is some this table or comparison chart between the pulse wave and the continuous wave. Pulse wave, this is the array transducer, most of us know it, and they can transmit the Doppler pulse. So this pulse wave transducer can operate with minimum one crystal, right? Spectral waveform and color range resolution. So in the spectral waveform and the color, okay, there is a range resolution. What does it mean? It means that I can see where the artery, where the vein, What is the flow here? What is the if I have the depth, at which depth? So there is a range resolution here. Okay, it has a limited maximum velocity, which is the aliasing. Okay, beyond this, I will get aliasing. This probe, or this the Pulseweave probe, it is as we mentioned earlier, it's an imaging transducer. It's damped, and that's why it has a low Q. It's a wide band of frequencies, low sensitivity, all the drawbacks that come with the damping of the transducer. Uh, we come here with the continuous wave. Continuous wave, this is we mean here the dedicated continuous wave. Again, we are not talking about the continuous wave activity in the array transducer. We talk about the continuous wave probe, which is the dedicated one. Okay, it can operate only with have two crystals. We cannot operate with one crystal because one crystal is either transmitting or receiving. I can't have the same crystal doing the two jobs. Again, there is spectral waveform only. We can't have an image, so there is no anatomy shown in the screen. That's why I get range ambiguity. I don't know where the vessel is located exactly. I don't have an image. Okay, unlimited maximum velocity, as we see here, because there is no aliasing. I have almost infinity or non-limited Nyquist limit. So there's no limitation actually for the Nyquist. There's no damping. That's why I have no image. There's a high Q, a narrow band of frequencies. Thank you, and hope that was beneficial. And I'm wishing to listen to your comments, guys, and let me know which part that I need to expand, which part I need to shrink in the future display.